After Jesus died, what happened to his 12 apostles? Let's find out on Made for Glory. One of my favorite parts about going to the eternal city, Rome, is seeing the tombs of the apostles. You can actually see the tomb of St. Peter, which is right directly underneath the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica. It's literally built over the rock upon which Jesus builds his church, which is when he changed his name from Simon to Peter. So over his tomb is built St. Peter's Basilica, also the tomb of St. Paul. St. Paul's outside the walls. There's also St. Philip and other saints that are there. But it's a good question to ask, to think about like what happened. We have some of the story, especially through the lens of St. Paul and some of St. Peter in the Acts of the Apostles. But outside of that, these 12 men that Jesus called, that he chose, that he set aside and consecrated as his first apostles, those who were sent. We would call them the first bishops of the church, the first patriarchs. What happened to them? And so we'll start with Peter, and we know that Peter was crucified, and usually by tradition crucified upside down under the Emperor Nero in the 60s, and the 60s, the first century of the 60s, probably about 66 AD, that he was executed under the Emperor Nero during his persecution of Christians. And then Paul, who's always kind of that honorary apostle, was also killed around that same time. He was beheaded because he was actually a Roman citizen, so he would not have been eligible for crucifixion, which was the death for slaves, the death for insurgents or revolutionaries, for dangerous people like Peter and, of course, like our Lord Jesus Christ. Going through the list here, a lot of this comes to us from the early church historian Eusebius. Andrew, who's the brother of St. Peter, he went to what Eusebius called the land of the man-eaters, which is what they referred to back then. It's now the present-day kind of Soviet Union era. He also ended up in Turkey and in Greece, and he was crucified in Greece. So he had a pretty wide missionary reach as well. One of the most fascinating is that of Thomas. Thomas, called the Doubting Thomas sometimes, he went throughout Syria, and by tradition, a pretty strong tradition, it says that he ended up in India, and that's eventually where he died as well. He died a martyr's death in India. So that all the apostles, except for John, according to tradition, died as martyrs. And so Thomas made it all the way to India, and we know that because actually in the 16th century, when Portuguese Catholic missionaries made it to India, when they were opening up trade routes to the east, they met Christians who had been Christians since the first century. And so they came to, we want to tell you about Jesus. Like we've known Jesus a lot longer than you Europeans have. So it's kind of a fascinating, well-attested historical tradition that so-called Doubting Thomas made it all the way to India and made converts there, made disciples, and established churches in India. Philip, it said, had a ministry in Carthage, North Africa, and Asia Minor, and he was eventually killed by a Roman proconsul. Matthew, the tax collector, writer of one of the Gospels, went to Persia and Ethiopia, and that some people say that he died in Ethiopia as a martyr. Bartholomew, who died a horrific death of being flayed alive, which you can see some pretty incredible depictions of that in art, including the Last Judgment of Michelangelo, that he had widespread missionary travels, went to Armenia, Ethiopia, and southern Arabia, and different accounts of how he was martyred and met his death. And then James, the son of Alphaeus, is one of at least the three the James referred to in the New Testament, that this James said to have ministered in Syria, and the historian Josephus reported that he was stoned and then clubbed to death. So then also we have Simon the Zealot. It's always an interesting figure. Ministered in Persia and died a martyr. Matthias, who was elected to replace Judas after his apostasy and suicide. He went to Syria with Andrew and died by being burned to death. And of course, John, the beloved disciple, was eventually exiled to the island of Patmos. It's said that the Romans tried to execute him and were unable to. He lived in Ephesus, taking care of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who was entrusted to him at the foot of the cross, and spent his last days in exile. And it's there that he had the visions for the book of Revelation. So it's an amazing reality. We don't have as much information as we do in the Acts of the Apostles for all of the apostles, but we do have very strong attested to traditions throughout the ancient world of these men who had met Jesus Christ had become his disciples, had followed in his footsteps, and had been sent out as witnesses to his death and his resurrection to the ends of the earth. And they fulfilled that mission. I think it's really awesome, too, that the church, the one holy Catholic and apostolic church, is built on those apostolic foundations. So being a member of the church, being part of the church that Jesus Christ founded, his holy Catholic Church, that we have the apostles as our older brothers in the faith, and that same apostolic faith is ours, that we're called to witness to today, to bring the good news of Jesus Christ to the ends of the earth. Hey guys, thanks for watching this latest episode of Made for Glory. Thank you so much to all of our sponsors. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to join us in sponsoring the show, make sure you click the link to support us via Patreon.